I've also heard that the whole narrative of like, well, no, I have had racism happen to me, but I overcame it. See, I'm still here. Look at how great this is for me. Well, no, that shouldn't have to be a daily lived reality. And that idea that you work hard enough, you'll get past it, it actually always is there. It won't. It won't actually allow you to thrive in a way that you can in a country that we are talking about being appreciative of. And in its worst cases, it kills.
On this past Sunday, June the 6th, a Muslim family of 5 went out for a walk in London, Ontario, here in Canada, when a 20-year-old white male slammed his truck into them, killing 4 of them, leaving the youngest, who was 9 years old, as the only survivor, who's now in the hospital. The London police called the act planned and premeditated. How do you even begin to process that? What is life going to be like for that 9-year-old now? Without his parents, without his family, without his sister? Why would anyone have so much hatred to kill someone for their religion? It's incomprehensible. As we struggle through the grief of this tragedy, it has also sparked conversations around the country on racism. And that's why I invited my friend Dr. Sonia Aujla-Bhullar, who is an academic with years of experience in the anti-racism work, to make sense of all the narratives that we're now hearing. Also, if you don't have the time to watch this video in its entirety, please download my podcast. It's called The Roop Rai Show, and it's available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Podcast Addict. Just download the app, search for The Roop Rai Show, and hit subscribe. Thank you. Without further ado, Dr. Sonia Aujla-Bhullar. Hi, Sonia.
Hello, Roop. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much again for making the time today.
Yeah, thank you.
As a country, we witnessed a murder, 4 murders this past weekend, and we've all been heartbroken. We've been grieving. But in the aftermath of these events, or in the aftermath of this terrorist attack, I would call it, there have been 2 rhetorics that have been very prominent in the country. And one of them is that Canada is a racist country, that there are hate crimes happening all over the place. And then there's the other rhetoric that is opposing that rhetoric, saying that this was a one-off incident, but Canada is a loving place, a loving country where people of all religions, of all colors, they're all coming out in support of the Muslim community who got impacted in this recent most terrorist attack. So what do you as an academic have to speak to that?
Yeah, you've really set it up nicely, like talking about the 2 different extremes, as you had said, right? Like these different opinions. And I think that's really important because the everyday person reading this, whether you're in Canada or not, you're kind of wondering, what is Canada? What does it stand for? What are its values? I've heard all these beautiful, positive things. It's a beautiful country. It's beautiful people here. It has been welcoming. I know within our own families, like being an South Asian immigrant, but specifically Punjabi Sikh, right? It's coming from an aspect of, well, we are here to have better at our lives. So be appreciative of that, right? I think the bigger conversation is, though, and that goes to what you're saying on the other side, really, we're talking about the gray areas all in between, is that Canada, as we know it, was founded on racist ideology. And that is embedded in a colonial legacy. And we don't have to look very far to see how colonial legacies impact our own way of life and thinking. Those of us who are from India and present-day Pakistan, which at one time was one large parcel of land, including Bangladesh, the colonial legacy and impact is embedded in a racist ideology. So is Canada racist? Yes, it is founded on racism, absolutely. Can we talk about Canada as being accepting and beautiful and tolerant people? Absolutely. We can talk about individual persons that way, yes. But as a whole country, we are all minds and bodies one together. We are coming as a whole entity. And that whole entity has been founded on, look to no farther than the remains of 215 children found 2 weeks ago today here in Kamloops. That has shocked people. But you know who it hasn't shocked? It hasn't shocked the communities who have been talking about it for decades, for a century, when no one believed them. If that's not racism as a system, whether we knew about it or not, we have to look at it in the face. It's ugly. It's the dark underbelly of Canada, but it is here. And there's no tripping around or tiptoeing around it saying, but there's beautiful thoughts and we're tolerant of one another. Actually, if we go back to the foundation of the very first people that were here, how can we begin to have a conversation of how we feel included? And this tragedy that happened with this family being murdered, Roop, I know you and I think the same way in this regard. That could have been any one of us wearing what we wear out for a walk with our family. How can we begin to talk about inclusiveness and acceptance and diversity if the very underbelly of where we are standing has children in the ground that have not been claimed or even believed by the systems in power?
Talking about the 215 children that were found 2 weeks ago, I spoke to Les Jerome, and I'm sure you might have seen that interview. And he said to me that he rolls his eyes every time he hears someone say that 215 children were recently found, because they, as a community, have always known that there were children buried under the ground, and they were just never heard, like you just said, that they were never heard, and no one cared. And when in that no one, I would also group in new immigrants as well, the South Asian communities, because we may hear of these things, but we don't really act on it. It's just something that happened to someone in some place. It doesn't impact us directly. So what would you say to South Asian audience who are listening today? Like, how does the 215 children or other issues in the indigenous community, how does it matter to us, or why should it matter to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it should matter to everybody because it is literally what our children are going to be asking every single one of us of what we did at this time point in our history, when we have for the first time, not first time it being heard, but it's been confirmed, right? And what was interesting that I found was with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A lot of people may not know this, might have read about it, but the stories that were coming forward from residential school survivors, they actually mentioned this over and over and over again, where Chief Justice Sinclair said, look, Canadian government, we need to have the funding and the means and the resources and support to go look for these children, to go do this. They were refused. They were told, no, we're not doing that. So that, like 5-6 years later, it's still there, hasn't gone away. So why should we care? Because when our stories, when our lived experiences are impacting our ability to thrive in our society, not just survive, okay? For new immigrants, I understand, like, we know that it's very difficult coming here. There's so many barriers that mainstream society does not fully understand or appreciate. But if we cannot look to how the lived experiences are then ignored and what impact that has on the first people that were here, we are no better. We are not very far behind, if not already going to have to experience that and answer to the next generations of what about this? So when we're advocating for our own experiences or the racism, it's not because we're trying to, and I think this is really important for our community to understand, because I've been in so many conversations with many of our South Asian communities. It's not that you're not accepting and appreciative of being here, but part of being here, the beautiful thing is asking the questions and holding people to account. We have to do that. We have to care enough to know that it's not one over the other, but racism is a reality. It's not something that we can choose. And therefore, if it's a reality to us, why should we not want to stop and change and not impact ourselves and our children? I always come back to the children because that's where I draw the line. If it is hurting children, anything, then it's just me stopping as a mother, as a school teacher, as just a person. That's where we have to care, because we can't say, well, no, my issue is here and I can't disagree with anything that's being done, or I can't voice it too much because I'm so happy to be here. You're allowed to be completely appreciative. You can also show appreciation by bettering this country. And I think that goes back to the roots of where this country has been founded on.
Mhm. I had a conversation with a friend yesterday, and he said that he hasn't faced any racism. He works with he's in an oil and gas company, and he hasn't faced any racism. And we furthered the conversation into me asking, "So you try to set up a new startup?" And he said, "I did." And I said, "How did that go?" "Oh, the doors didn't open for me in the upper management. No one was wanting to listen to him." And I said, "Well, talk about racism, right?" And then he had to partner up with a white partner for the doors to start opening. And that's a real life anecdote. And yet, the first reaction that he came to me with was, "I have never faced racism." I think sometimes we're living in a bubble where we want to think that nothing bad is happening to us, right? So we're not getting discriminated against because that's just how we want it to be. And we ignore perhaps the systemic racism is prevalent. So how do we make ourselves more aware, and how do we address issues like that when they do crop up?
Yeah, well, that the conversation that you just had with that person is a pattern that we really often see. It's a pattern, and that's a difference between racism as an interpersonal experience. So, what you said before, a one-off, right? Like I've had many of those. I'm sure you have had too, where somebody calls you a name and all of those things. Those are absolutely wrong and completely harmful. The thing about that is that they become patterns. And so if we can have a conversation and say, "Oh, that happened to me as well. Oh, this happened to me as well," then that pattern becomes solidified. Like I literally think of it as like it's like building blocks, right? And that's the systemic piece where we don't see representation in upper management, where you're not called for the interview because of your last name. When you have to question when you're at a work meeting or you're going to your children's school to try to express some concerns, and you have that moment where you think, "Am I not being listened to because I am?" That in itself is how racism perpetuates itself in a systemic way. And the only way to come against that is when we are not only speaking about out against it, but we're actually seeing meaningful change in policies and procedures and the very structures of institutions that have so far worked without us having to voice any of this. Everything seems to be going okay in the economy and all of those things, very generalized, like generally speaking, for a large segment of our population. But the populations it's not working for, their voices are not being heard. So then that change cannot happen because it's a cycle. The systemic racism represses your voice. And then when you speak up and you hear people, I've also heard that the whole narrative of like, "Well, no, I have had racism happen to me, but I overcame it. See, I'm still here. Look at how great this is for me." Well, no, that shouldn't have to be a daily lived reality. And that idea that you work hard enough, you'll get past it, it actually always is there. It won't. It won't actually allow you to thrive in a way that you can in a country that we are talking about being appreciative of. And in its worst cases, it kills. And that should never happen. So those one-offs when people are saying name calling and all of those things, hate incidents, moving to hate crimes, those all build. Again, those are the layers where it ends up hurting people and destroying ways of life. And that's what we just saw 2 days ago. And it's almost too difficult to completely talk about out of respect for the mourning and knowing what this family, the extended family, must be going through, especially this 9-year-old child. I have an 11-year-old son, an 8-year-old daughter. It's so difficult to talk about because it's so close to home. And then you think of all the children that have suffered or had their lives ended because of this conversation. So I find it very problematic when persons say, "Well, I haven't experienced racism," or "I have experienced racism, but it's not a big deal." It has to be a big deal to a point of why would we want anyone to be living without some semblance to human dignity. We should all be treated with dignity and respect, right? It shouldn't be based on the fact of how people view your religion, your color of skin, your gender, or any of those pieces.
I'll share another anecdote that I've heard often is that we're a minority in this country, so we need to just take it. And but then speaking back to the colonial mindset that you spoke about earlier, well, in India, the white people, the white man or a white woman, whoever, the white person, when they come in India, they're still treated with respect, like they're the sahibs, that they're someone superior. And we carry that with us here to these countries as well. So it's not just about us being a minority here, it's also in India. This attitude is also prevalent in India as well. So it's got more to it than just us being a minority. It's about this colonial mindset. We were colonized for a very long time, and there is a certain way that generations were brainwashed, or they were trained to think in a certain way. And we need to start critically thinking about that and perhaps question everything, like you said, and then pave a path, a better path for our future generations.
Roop, you hit the nail on the head. This is what we term as internalized racism, and that is multi-generational. It's not like even race in itself, right? Like when we talk about race and racism, it is a social construction. Yes, babies and children are not born understanding this. We actually, society forms this understanding. It's constructed. We co-construct it. We all come together and have this understanding. So the generations prior to us, we do have internalized oppression, internalized racism. We can look no farther than looking at how we describe one's color of skin within our communities. What is valued, what is sought after, and what is seen as less than or debilitating to people who are of darker hue, right? Darker colored skin in our own community. So yeah, there's all of those critical questions. It's also going to take a lot of us asking ourselves these hard questions. And I want to point out the fact that, because I think you've heard this too from persons when they say, well, it's like, we don't want to hate white people. Isn't that the same thing? Or is it the white man and all of that? So I'm going to give your listeners a little bit of a basics 101 in how this is actually approached, okay? So there's individualism, right? We talked about interpersonal racism, one person, we can do that. We're also talking with the colonial legacy and everything, we're talking about an umbrella of what is termed as white supremacy. So not white people, I'm not saying all white people, but I am saying whiteness as the umbrella, as the supreme standard by which we all equate ourselves to, right? That's internalized racism, because that is what we're founded on. That's within our policies, our laws, our governance, the colonial legacies. And if we start to understand white supremacy, and this is also for white persons that I've worked with who are in the work of anti-racism and education or talking about these issues, they understand it very well, that it's not personal to them. No one's attacking them personally, but they are in recognition that the systems, the way that our country has worked, has kept them safe, included, and prosperous without them having to experience racism and all of these other things. So that doesn't mean that people don't have a hard time getting through things. Everyone has their own personal struggles, but race is not one of them. That social construction is not one of them for white community. And so that's what I refer to as white supremacy. And a lot, like for the most part, I think that conversation is starting to be understood, that it's not an individual attack. It's not one person, but it's also getting away from that. Well, this is just a one-off incident. No, this is operating under a whole umbrella of white supremacy, right? The person who deliberately ran into this family was not radicalized recently, like I don't know the details about that, but we have seen an uptake. Facts don't lie, statistics don't lie. The domestic terrorism within Canada and the United States is often perpetuated by young white men. And that in itself is something to be critically looked at and not seen as, well, that's just a one-off or someone's upset. No, that never has been given. That benefit of the doubt has never been given to anyone else, right? We all many of us experienced the aftermath of 9/11. People
Mm-hmm.
were killed right away. Six men were killed because they looked Muslim, right? Muslims were killed because they represented an other that was dangerous. That's all under white supremacy. It doesn't take it's not one individual that can change this. It's not one individual that made this up. It's a whole system that we're a part of that we don't even know about. Where a lot of us maybe are unconscious to it, or we're consciously denying this because it is too difficult to talk about.
To wrap up, what would your advice be to the listeners today, that what can they do on an individual level to address this inequality or inequity in the society?
Great question. And the individual level, first and foremost, again, I think I mentioned this last time too when I was on your show, contact your elected representatives. That is their position to hear your concerns, voicing them. And the next part to that is the follow through, the follow up, right? It doesn't just happen at election times where you vote in a person that you agree with, but really who has actually done the work to this. And that means changing laws. That means holding things to account. In 2017, when the Quebec City mosque massacre occurred, that was not seen as a terrorist incident, domestic terrorism, right? So when you know that happened, and now we're in 2021, and these are the most extreme examples, but doesn't make them any less or any more prevalent and no more part of a system that we are all facing every day in our lives, a part of. But where does that change in terms of governance? How will that not happen again? And I think that's when we really carefully have to listen, not only to the politicians, but actually what they're putting forward and how it's understood by us. If you don't understand something that's being said, you ask your MLA, you ask your MP, what does this exactly mean? What does this mean for me? And then apart from the individual, there's many individuals who are carrying this work forward, which I personally don't think that they should have to be doing this, but this is where change happens. It's those grassroots organizations, the committees that are struck up, the boards. They are the ones that you could follow and support, whether it's financially, whether it's asking more questions, lending your voice to it. Really get into that. I don't know, designate one person in your family to get into the one issue that you think your top 3 issues of the family that's of concern to you. Designate each person to go and do that work and to be on top of MLAs and just forcing that in there, because then with all the individual voices, there ends up being a collective voice. And there ends up being questions and there can be change. But for individuals right at this moment, I would really, really like to stress, Roop, and I hope everyone has listened to your previous interview with Les, but I'd really like to stress that understanding the anti-Indigenous sentiment, which has resulted in a genocide here in Canada, is fundamental to knowing how and where we can live amongst one another in a way that we want Canada to be. Whether we think Canada is there or not, everyone can have different opinions. I think we can always do better. So what is your ideal Canada? And we have to start there. We have to support that work and those voices and honoring those children, which this isn't the last we're going to hear of this. It's going to get worse before it gets better in terms of mainstream society knowing what the atrocities were. But really start that work now. I would implore people to really center that in your conversations around with family, with your children, learn about it, because it's absolutely where we need to start and end this work.
And Les mentioned something that I have been thinking about since I spoke to him, is think about everything critically. And I think I've already mentioned this in this interview because it really impacted me, is just forming your thoughts and forming your opinions with a critical thought. So don't take everything on its face value, especially when you see it in social media, when you see a politician speak it, or when you don't know what anyone's agenda is when they're talking, right? It's do your own research, question everything that anyone is saying. I think that's also very important. All right.
Absolutely.
That's what I learned from Les. Yeah.
Great lessons.
Well, yeah, lessons from Les.
There we go. We can start a
Uh,
whole new thing.
I did tell him that. I did tell him. I texted him. I said, "Hey, you have to come back because anyone and everyone who I respect, who listened to that interview, listened to him speak, were absolutely amazed with him and his knowledge. And of course, like I like that he didn't take that extreme path on either way. And he attributes that to his age. He says it's because he's been doing this for a very long time. As a young man, he was a radical and he was very angry. And over the years, he has found that middle ground. And I think that's something that all of us need to see and hear as well.
Absolutely. I think there's a place for anger because there has been so detrimental. But again, like you
Yes.
said, asking the questions and getting through the anger, because the anger is
Yeah.
the front for so much else that's happened. So we have to embrace the anger in order to move forward together, I think. But ask the questions. I completely concur to that.
Well, thank you so much. And like Les, I know I'll call on you again as well for your knowledge, for your expertise, and for all the work that you do. I'm completely. I always tell you that I'm completely in awe of you for all the work that you do, the empathy that you bring into the work that you do. You make it personal. You do it from your heart, and that's what makes you special.
Yeah, thanks, Roop. And I'm gonna send that back to my kids and all the students I've had over the last decade of teaching. They're the ones that keep me driving forward, and I won't stop because it's for them. It's all for the kids when we're long gone.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.